The mortuary sat silent except for the storm raging outside. Victor Crane's breath fogged in the frigid air, the faint scent of formaldehyde clinging to every surface. He held the matchstick between trembling fingers, the weak flame dancing as he scanned the room.
"Clara!"
he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the howling wind that clawed at the windows. He stumbled toward the slab where her body had lain moments ago, only to find the pristine sheet crumpled, streaked with blood. A single drop of red splattered onto the floor with a faint patter, as if taunting him. His heart thundered in his chest, louder than the storm itself. The silence was broken by a low chant, guttural and rhythmic, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound pressed against his skull, a sinister hymn that made the shadows stretch and writhe like living things. His eyes darted around the room, desperate to find the source, but there was only darkness. Then he heard it, a faint rustling like leaves scraping across stone, followed by the unmistakable creak of floorboards. His pulse quickened as the noise grew louder, coming closer, accompanied by the sound of chains dragging across wood. "Clara, if this is you, I'm not afraid," he shouted, his voice breaking. The echoing whisper that followed seemed to mock him, repeating his words in a distorted cadence. Not afraid. He turned toward the embalming station where his tools had been neatly arranged, only to find the instruments scattered across the floor. The scalpel lay closest, its blade glinting faintly in the dim light. As he reached for it, the room filled with the sound of laughter, low, cruel, and inhuman. A gust of icy wind slammed into him, extinguishing the match in his hand. Suddenly, the faint meow of a cat broke the tension. Victor spun around to see a black feline perched on the edge of the slab, its eyes glowing like embers. It hissed violently, its back arching as it stared past him. Victor turned to follow its gaze, and the room seemed to shift, the walls bending inward as if the space itself were alive. "Victor." The voice was unmistakable this time. It was Clara's, soft, melodic, yet tinged with an unnatural edge. He turned slowly, his breath catching as he saw her standing in the doorway. Her hair fell in tangled waves over her pale shoulders, her eyes glistening with an unholy light. She smiled, but it wasn't the warm, loving smile he remembered. This was something else, feral, predatory. "You came back." His voice cracked, tears streaming down his face as he stepped toward her. "I knew you would. I knew our love was stronger than death." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You promised me eternity, Victor," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally, overlapping with the ringing of a distant church bell. "Will you keep that promise?" "Yes, anything," he cried, dropping to his knees before her. She reached out, her cold fingers brushing his cheek. The touch sent a jolt through him, as if her very presence drained the warmth from his body. "Then give me all of you," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. The sound of glass breaking punctuated her words as the room plunged into chaos. The embalming equipment flew from the shelves, crashing to the floor in a cacophony of metallic clangs and shattering glass. The storm outside intensified, the roar of thunder shaking the foundation of the building. Victor's head swam, his vision blurring as her fingers dug into his shoulders. "Anything," he murmured, his voice weak, his body trembling. She smiled again, leaning closer. Her breath was cold against his neck as she whispered, "Then let me take what's mine." Before he could respond, she lunged forward, her teeth sinking into his chest. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a searing agony that spread through his body as blood poured from the wound. He screamed, the sound echoing through the mortuary, mingling with the scream of the wind and the groan of creaking wood. Clara's laughter filled the room, a chilling, inhuman sound that drowned out everything else. Victor fell to the floor, clutching his neck as the blood pooled around him. His vision dimmed, but he could still see her standing over him, her eyes glowing brighter now, her smile impossibly wide. As his life slipped away, he realized the truth. Clara hadn't come back for love. She had come back to feed. As Victor's vision faded to black, his body slackening against the cold, blood-soaked floor, the mortuary fell eerily silent, save for the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. But then, the air stirred with a haunted breath. a low rasp echoing in the stillness. Clara's figure bent down, her head cocked unnaturally as if listening to something distant. "Oh, Victor," she murmured, her voice dripping with mockery. "Did you think I came back alone?" A sudden bang, followed by the clatter of chains rattling against the wall. Clara stood, her smile widening grotesquely as a spooky lullaby began to play faintly, distorted and off-key, from nowhere and everywhere. The chimes of a clock striking midnight reverberated through the air as the storm outside reached its climax, with thunder cracking and the howl of wolves echoing in the distance. From the shadows, another figure emerged, distorted, writhing, its form a mass of shifting darkness. The air turned icy as distant screams filled the mortuary, mingling with the hiss of wind through broken windows. "Victor," Clara said softly, kneeling beside his lifeless body, her voice barely audible over the low drone noise that had begun to hum in the background. "You gave me everything, but I was never yours to keep." She turned her gaze toward the shadowy figure, her laughter rising, cruel and resonant. The figure extended a long skeletal hand toward Victor's corpse, and for a brief moment his eyes snapped open, wide with terror. From beneath him, the crackling of fire erupted as the floor seemed to collapse into a swirling void of darkness. His scream, piercing and raw, was cut off by the slam of a metal door, leaving only the faint whistling of wind and the distant cry of children. The last sound to echo in the room was a subtle buzzing like static before everything fell deathly silent. But in the silence, a faint whisper emerged, echoing unnaturally as if from within the walls. "Love is eternal, Victor, and so is the feast." The faint scraping of metal broke the silence, sharp and deliberate, as if someone was dragging a blade across stone. Victor's body twitched again, but this time the movement was unmistakable. His head jerked violently to the side and his eyes snapped open, clouded but alive with something far from human. The haunted breathing in the room deepened, accompanied by reverberating footsteps that seemed to circle him. The blade's sound grew louder, knife sharpening now, rhythmic and unrelenting as Clara emerged from the shadows holding a long, gleaming carving knife. The thunder cracked outside, illuminating the mortuary in a flash of blinding light, and for an instant Victor saw them. Others, dozens of figures, decayed and grinning, lining the room. The distant screams began again, rising and falling like a macabre chorus as Clara bent over him, her grin widening. "You didn't think this was the end, did you?" she cooed, her voice dripping with mockery. From outside, the sound of eerie wind chimes mingled with the hiss of wind and the faint, distant cries of children. Suddenly, a door slammed violently, and the knife in Clara's hand began to hum as if alive, vibrating with an unnatural energy. She raised it high, her voice now blending with echoing whispers and the chime of a distant bell. But before the blade could descend, Victor's lips parted, and a guttural voice emerged, not his own. "This body is mine now," it growled, a sound that echoed with the weight of countless voices. The creaking floorboards beneath him groaned as his limbs moved with an inhuman speed, his hand gripping Clara's wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor with a sudden bang. From the darkness, a low drone began to hum, growing louder and more oppressive as Victor sat upright, his movements jerky and unnatural. Clara's grin faltered for the first time, replaced by wide-eyed terror as he whispered, "The feast isn't over. It's just begun." Then, with a snap of his fingers, the room plunged into complete silence, broken only by the faint sound of chains rattling in the distance.